I'd like to start our program. I'm first going to introduce Casey Green, who you'll be hearing from shortly. Casey has been with us again and again and again, and we're so happy to have him. He came in first thing this morning on a red eye from California. Casey is the founding director of the Campus Computing Project, which does the massive survey of higher education, technology, information technology, and actually it started now working with e-learning to determine what's happening in our world with the technology and education. Casey is going to be moderating the panel this morning. I also, and I don't see him, where's Sean? There he is. Come on over here, Sean. As we begin, I am going to introduce one of our graduating seniors. And you know, this is like, what is it, like in a week and a half is graduation? So here is a success story. This is, come on up with me. Very excited. Here's one graduating senior. This is Sean McGraw. And he, unique, but we also find this happen here at Case, is that we have double majors again and again. And Sean is also a double major in mechanical engineering and film production. So if you're really wondering how he pulled that off, you can talk to Sean. We open our day with a video that Sean put together, kind of addressing some of the questions that we're asking today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over.
All right, so like Wendy said, my name is Sean. I am finishing up here. And like she addressed earlier, this whole conference is about basically the interplay between education and society. So I interviewed some students and also a professor here at Case, and we were just trying to, kind of condense and really attack those two questions. So I really hope that this video that I put together resonates and hopefully initiates some thought and dialogue.
We have a slight disconnect, in my view, between graduating seniors from universities and some of the bigger societal problems.
Humans developed as a society, we keep progressing as a society because one generation can sum up all the knowledge that they have, put it in a textbook, put it on the internet, store it, and pass it on to the next generation.
I actually don't think that society benefits depending on someone's education. It's really benefiting on the person they are. So you can lead students to all these fancy classes, but if they're not interested in it, it's just going to go in one ear and out the other. They're just going to do the work. They're just going to get the grade. And maybe someone who is a certain Myers-Briggs stereotype would do the job better. So I don't know if you want a society full of people who are happy doing what they're doing or efficient doing what they're doing.
I definitely do think that educational systems in the United States shoot for the bottom.
We definitely need to have more experiential learning in school, but finding new methods to expose the students to the real world rather than just a textbook or a classroom.
I think technology has a huge part to play. The social networks that are now available that weren't available even 10 years ago, completely redefining how perhaps students interact, how they address course material. But if we look at our classes, if we look at our courses, you've got 50 students sitting on their backsides, somebody at the front with a PowerPoint presentation. Maybe that's not the best way.
What I always felt going through school was that, yes, it was valuable, but it was very intangible. So I really, I see the degree as being like a badge you can flash. Students learn better, I think, when they see that the things that they're learning have real-world value. And I think that a lot of times that's hard to translate over. It's not really ever emphasized that you're going to be giving back to society.
The bigger problems that face society require a much broader education, which students probably don't get until they actually leave university and start interacting in the real world.
The problem is almost entirely a lack of perspective. You know, the teachers are going to ultimately determine how good the kids are, and the kids are going to eventually grow up and determine how good our society is.
Colleges and schools need to seriously look at the structure of their degree programs to see whether it still matches society's needs. And maybe 20 years ago, there was a very good match. I don't think we do a good job at the moment. I think society has changed so radically over the last 10, 15 years that the educational programs everywhere, it's very difficult to see how they've kept up with those changing needs. And you know, it's time. It's time to make the change.
I think with a hand for Sean.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Wendy and everyone that's helped me through this process, because they've been very supportive of my busy student schedule. But basically, so as you saw, I started out by interviewing students, and it turns out I interviewed the professor last, and he seemed to summarize a lot of what we were trying to say. While some of the students, we approach these questions very broadly, you know, and metaphors abound. You know, we are a part of the wide machine of society where we're cogs, and education helps us integrate ourselves. But really, we moved a little bit further inside and tried to kind of feel out the personal responses to this. What are we getting from education, and how are we then, you know, kind of reflecting that outside of school? We entertain notions of kind of, you know, what if we had more of a hiatus between the soft cushioning of high school and entering college, you know, because it's not until you leave college do you actually associate yourself with society's problems, because you are rather guarded within, you know, the institution. I also kind of probed, you know, what if earlier on, because it seems, you know, you have this quarter-life crisis, kind of, you know, feeling out what major and what you want to do and what your decision is, that kind of then resonates for the next, you know, 30 or 40 years, however long you're going to work. And I was asking, well, what if, you know, while you were an early student, what if you had a lot more career days? What if every week maybe, you know, you got introduced to another profession? You know, you looked out at society while you were still in that very introductory education. So really, I just want to finish and say, you know, I hope that this kind of education can be bridged a lot better, especially with the this digital age, and how we are really, you know, reaching out to a lot of different students and a lot of different information and knowledge, but really building on that knowledge and then really taking it and pushing it into the real world. So I would like to thank you.
Sean, don't go away. Good morning. I'm Casey Green. Wendy was very kind in her introduction. So there's two follow-up questions I'd like to ask on behalf of the panel, because you've queued us up. The first, anything surprising in the interviews, either what we saw or the stuff that was on the cutting room floor?
I mean, like I said, it started out very broad, and it was very challenging to really, you know, get rid of that boilerplate and move in. Surprising? Not so much. I really do feel what's on students' minds kind of was reflected in, you know, there is that unrest, and there's how can we go ahead and take this education and really, how does it reflect? As Nathan in the video said, you know, it's very intangible, and we need to see that interplay.
Great. The second question, I'm going to ask this tactfully, and then I'm going to be very blunt. You're graduating?
Yes.
Mechanical engineering and film, correct?
Yes.
What are your plans for after graduation? That's the polite way of saying, do you have a job, right?
I do not have a job.
Okay. So noted, audience. We have another college graduate looking for a job. Many of us have had the same experience coming out of college, okay? What?
What? But I am hoping to attend film grad school in the fall.
Oh, so you're going to grad school. Well, that's a job.
More learning. Yeah.
Have you been accepted to grad school?
Yes.
Okay, so you've got something to do for the fall.
Yes, exactly.
You're coming back for more.
Yeah, a lot more learning. You know, I haven't had enough. Yeah.
All right, great. Let's have a hand for Sean. So good morning. I'm Casey Green. I'm with the Campus Computing Project. The tagline for the work I've been doing for the past 2 decades is everybody else has opinions about information technology. We try to bring data to the conversation. Can we bring up the first slide, please? And I'd like to introduce our panel. We should have a slide that shows their profiles. That should be the next one up. As that slide comes up, here we go. So our title for this session is Push to Pull, Society, Higher Education, and Technology. The bios for the panel are in your booklets just very quickly, and this is the cheap laugh. From my left to going across your right to left, whatever it might be. Deborah Keyek Franssen is at the University of Colorado Boulder, Gardner Campbell at Virginia Tech, and Joan Getman is my colleague crosstown at USC. I'm not affiliated with any university, but she geographically is crosstown in Los Angeles. And we're going to wander the landscape a little bit in terms of the video and some other issues about society, student preparation, the tension between student preparation for life as opposed to student preparation for jobs. I want to set this up a little bit. Can we go to the next slide, please? Some of you may know that in the last week or so, the National Governors Association issued a new report talking about the role of higher education from the perspective of the states and the issue of states' investment. And early in the report, the Governors Association sort of puts the stake in the ground to say the questions that most concern governors: how do we know that the degrees and certificates the student is pursuing are the ones that they will need for the new jobs? We keep talking, and we have talked for decades about the changing workforce in higher education. What's the half-life of a college degree in certain areas, particularly science, technology, and engineering, computer science? And the second question is, are we producing degrees that provide the greatest chance of providing the most benefit in terms of individual benefit, expansion of horizons, lifelong learning, comprehension, whatever it might be, the needs of industry and society, and also the state economy, looking at economic development issues, which every time we go through an economic downturn, obviously and understandably emerge. Next slide, please. Another report out recently from Inside Higher Ed, released on March 4th. Disclosure, Campus Computing worked with Inside Higher Ed on this project. This is one of the largest surveys of college presidents done in recent years, in recent decades. One of the items that we asked presidents, some 956 who participated in the survey, what is it that your institution does well? What is it that your campus does well? The top 3 items, one of them is not shown here. Well, we manage our financial resources well during a time of financial difficulty. How many of you first work at Case? Too many. I won't ask that question if you agree with the presidents. But the other thing the presidents told us in the survey is that they do believe their institutions, up and down, left and right, public and private, research universities through community colleges, and also for-profits, overwhelmingly they believe their institutions provide a quality undergraduate, and almost 3 in 5 said that they feel that they're preparing their students for the future. We're going to hold on that for a moment. We're going to talk about future preparation. I want to come to the panel. So we heard students talk about a little bit about where they go, what they learn. Deb, what was your reaction to the video?
I liked what the one student said. It was interesting when Sean said that the professor kind of summed it all up. And actually, I thought one of the young women who said, what is it we're supposed to be, happy or efficient? That really kind of got to the heart of it, where I thought, and of course we can argue the meaning of happiness, but that really for me got at it. She was really struggling with what is the purpose, first of all, of my education, and how does that translate out into the real world?
Yeah. Gardner, what's your take? I mean, you come at this, I think, a little differently. Your background is as an English professor, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Yes. So you are a true academic. We might tongue-in-cheek say a true tweed compared to some of us. Okay.
You'd have to ask my fellow academics if I'm a true academic.
Okay.
I think that question is currently under peer review, and we should hear in about 5 years.
All right.
I hear this constant dichotomy between education and the real world. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of both.
But that's not, wait, I want to kind of, that's not a new dichotomy. I mean, we've always talked on college campuses between the safe haven of academia and the real world, whether it's the work of faculty members and staff, and also students saying, I'm here and I don't want to go out there.
So let's talk about always.
Okay.
I'd say always, in this case, goes back about 150 years. One of the challenges we're facing in a democratic society is making the benefits of this kind of concentrated cognitive development available to as many citizens as possible, because in a democracy we believe that self-governance in a community of civic participation is the wisest, best form of government. This itself was thought of as a radical experiment. Right. Early political theorists said, democracy, that's mob rule. You're kidding me. You're going to let people without land go and vote on a leader? You're going to let people... women. Well, yeah, so exactly.
But that was a long time ago. It's a comment, it's not an effort.
So let's think about the radical part of this.
Yeah.
Education as an ideal in a democratic society is even more radical because it's the foundation of that democratic society. That dichotomy between education and the real world, I think it's an artifact of the industrial age.
Joan, radical ideas?
Pardon me?
Radical ideas?
The radical ideas go back to the early 1900s. I was actually thinking about John Dewey, an educator and friend in LA, said you should go read about this man who is an advocate for honoring teachers and putting forth the idea that schools are actually a place of social action and change. And this was 1902. And he was saying that the only way that that was going to happen is if you encourage students to have experiences in learning, so that their learning experiences are addressing challenges they're going to face, and start them early, thinking about those challenges before they leave school. And again, this is 1901.
The students that we heard from in the video, and the students that many of us work with day in and day out, seem to gravitate to the issue of experience more than the isolated. They're looking for that link. Again, that's not new, but in many ways, we've seen that accelerated in terms of the role of internships, in the role of more student engagement, particularly in this type of institution, many others, student involvement as an undergraduate in research, other kinds of things. Are we doing better at providing those kinds of experiences, Joan?
I think that one of the things, capstone projects, internships, they imply that they happen episodically, here and there, at the end of a semester. And what I keep thinking is we're not doing as good a job of weaving that into the material. So there's that disconnect in the course where you're doing work towards something and then you get to do some project that, as opposed to having the whole experience be grounded in
Gardner,
some challenge.
Are we doing a better job, though? Think about your own experience as an undergraduate and those of your counterparts, whether they were in English or engineering or all points in between.
So, excuse me, so the comparison you're drawing is a better job now than back in the dark ages?
I won't question the issue that we ought to do better. What I want to get a sense of historically, in the context of our lifetimes, from the time you were an undergraduate to what you see on campuses today. Are we doing better at that?
Yes, there is a greater professed emphasis on experiential learning than there was when I was an undergraduate.
You say professed with an odd emphasis.
Yeah, no, thank you for picking that up. I think if we're not careful, we'll think, oh, what we need is for the institution to sponsor another program. My feeling is that the institution itself needs to re-examine its own foundations. Students, in that video, what I heard them say was, we have schools that are not thinking about the needs of learners. Schools are thinking about the needs of schools. And schools are thinking about the needs of the professors who populate the schools.
Shocking.
I would disagree somewhat with that. So if we look at, I think we're all talking about post-secondary institutions that are four-year research institutions. I think that's our experience. But if we look at community colleges, I think they are most definitely concerned about, now maybe not about learning in the broad philosophical lovely sense that makes our hearts stir, but rather they're thinking about the students and saying, what jobs will they get? And what internships do they have to get those jobs? So I think that we, Casey asked us a question in some of our preparatory materials about the diversity of institutions. And I think that by pulling in the community colleges, we start talking about access, we start talking about experiential learning, we start talking about focus on the students.
So I need a clarification. When we talk about experiential learning, are we talking about internships to prepare people for specific jobs? Or are we talking about what Dewey said, which is education is not a preparation for living, it's part of the process of living itself?
Isn't higher education actually talking about both, and sometimes concurrently, and sometimes with great difficulty? I mean, at one level, there is, particularly for students in a down labor market, and this is not a unique event now. We had one at the beginning of the decade during in the wake of 9/11, the dot-com crash. Some of us who graduated from college a long time ago in the early 1970s entered a down labor market. It was a down labor market in the early years of the Reagan administration. It was a down labor market in the early years of the first Bush administration. Understandably, when, if you want to take a Maslow model of it, you want hierarchy of needs, first thing I want when I get out of college is I want a job. And yet at the same time, I think, Gardner, to your point, isn't it that we want the best of both? We want experience with a capital E in the context of Dewey, and we want experience as a lowercase e that we can slap onto a resume and push through some kind of filter on the internet to say, take me, hire me over here. Yes? No? Maybe?
It seems like you have opportunities to connect with community and with those potential employers early and often in the educational process. And I'm seeing at the institutions I've been at more of an effort to do that. And that helps create the channels.
I have to come back to what we saw in the video. Yeah. The degree is a badge that you flash.
Not a new statement.
No, not a new statement. But when the governors are saying, are we producing the right kinds of degrees, that question to me is not only the wrong question, doesn't even understand what a degree is.
Right.
Right? What's the difference between a degree and a major? How does a degree relate to curriculum? How does all of that relate to what students feel as an authentic development of self with capacities they're going to need for a life of learning? Not just
I want to actually, you've given me a good springboard. Can we bring up the next slide, please? Because I want to take us back 60 years. Next slide, please. And this is Higher Education for American Democracy. In 1947, Harry Truman received what was the first of 6 volumes of a historic post-war report titled Higher Education for American Democracy. This is Truman's statement at the initial ceremony for the first volume. Higher education in our nation today is confronted with tremendous responsibilities. We could dust that off, and that speaks to some of the conversation we're having here. We are challenged by the need to ensure that higher education will take its proper place in our national effort to strengthen democracy at home and to improve our understanding of our friends and neighbors everywhere in the world. Truman and the report certainly didn't dismiss the issue of employment and a changing post-war labor market in the United States and elsewhere. But also, I think, Gardner, in some ways spoke to the issues you're trying to raise with us as well. There are a variety of objectives on the part of different stakeholders and constituencies for the role of higher education. This one obviously is framed a little bit by the experience of the Second World War and the emerging Cold War environment, but we could dust this off, and in our own world, where we talk about emerging democracies, some of this still remains the same. Joan? I'm sorry, Deb.
No, I actually think that based on some discussions I've been having back in the IT shop, so I'm deep within the IT shop right now, which is an interesting place to be. Take the word, I'm sorry, I should point up here, democracy out and put in market. So when I speak to some of the IT folks in our shop, what I got back was we need to prioritize based on what IT services we offer, based on the dollar value of those services. This is not a learning institution. This is a business and an enterprise. And that, I think,
that's a dramatic change in the conversation. Absolutely,
huge.
Yes.
But I think that that's pervasive throughout, that I think that even though, again, when I really talk about the joy that higher education brings me, it's not about making widgets. And yet I think that's where the dialogue is. That's the vocabulary that people can grapple with, and that's what they relate to.
Yeah, we're seeing this conversation about business models. Why doesn't higher ed operate more like a business? Of course, we can't amortize our mistakes or let the SEC wave a wand when we make some bad investments, can we?
Well, I'd also like to know which business we're supposed to operate like. Google? General Motors? Which one?
Oh, I'm with you.
Yeah.
Right. One of the unnamed banking institutions that brought us our lovely economic future.
Mm-hmm. Joan, you look like you're ready to jump in on this.
Oh, just that, and I was thinking about another piece of this statement, which is that we're improving our understanding of our friends and neighbors everywhere in the world. I think one of the things as we look in the communities where we are, and I'm in LA now, is that we're actually trying to understand the cultures in our own backyard, that there's such diversity and such a shift in the population now, and especially on the West Coast, that it's understanding global, if that's possible to do, global at home in our own borders, and that's another challenge in the institution.
I'm thinking about a radio interview I heard with Gordon Gee, who's once again the president of Ohio State, at which point, and it was halftime during a Buckeye game, so that was filler, obviously. I was driving someplace in southern Ohio, and he proudly boasted that during his second tenure at Ohio State, the proportion of undergraduates at Ohio State who now have passports, whether they came from rural Ohio or urban Ohio or suburban Ohio, had grown dramatically. Over half, and a large number had some kind of study abroad or going abroad experience. Now, it may have been in a pub in the United Kingdom or Australia. It may have been someplace else where the culture, the language was very different, but at least there was an effort to push out the same way. And we are seeing some of this conversation about globalization and expanding horizons, both in a truly global economy, but I think, Joan, to your point as well, we're also seeing the global nature of our own ecosystems in our own cities and our own states. Anybody want to respond to that? You're going to let me hang there.
I like that.
You
I like the
that?
measure. I mean, what a great measure. We don't have very many measures, but there's a quantitative one we can throw out to people, and it's so rich. It has such meaning behind it.
What other measures should we be looking for?
I'd like to know how many students are actually in some kind of ongoing social network contact with someone in another culture. I'd like to know that. And the other culture could be in their backyard, or it could be across the globe. When I look at these words, Harry Truman didn't have the internet. We do. This is a profound shift in the way we think about ourselves as a world. Look at just what happened, right? Look at somebody inadvertently tweeting an attack on the compound in Pakistan. And we see that. I got a screenshot of it too, but not from CNN. I went to his Twitter stream. You could do that. It's public. So to what extent does this now take on an even bigger and more important role in this era of global telecommunications?
Are the stakes higher than they were in the context of our time than they were in the context of Truman's time? Or is this just kind of conical in the sense we're kind of rotating around the same area, not somewhat in the sense of similar themes, slightly different implementations? The issues about democracy, globalization, preparing students for a broader perspective.
I think you can make a bigger difference faster with social networking than you ever could before. I think we've seen that in the Middle East.
Okay. You really can reach out and touch in some very interesting ways. Great.
I mean, that's the very optimistic. I think that's the sunshine view of it. I also think that there are just as many people reaching out and touching people who are just, and that sounds terrible, but just like themselves.
It's safe touch, isn't it?
It's safe touch. So it's happy. It's happy.
It better be safe touch.
Yes. But I mean, how many people are just, I don't know, following Lady Gaga? You know?
Central role of education. Why are we not structuring opportunities for our students to be able to learn to do something other than reach out beyond their own tribes? Instead, we're saying, oh, please, no laptops in this room. I understand they're Facebooking. They're Facebooking because they don't have anything else to do in that space using those technologies.
Well, boredom is endemic to college classrooms. That's not new, whether or not you've got a notebook computer and a wireless network.
Not mine. I'll bet not in his.
I wasn't suggesting it was yours. I wasn't suggesting it was any of yours. Some of you may have had experiences while you were in college or know of your colleagues who teach that may not be quite as engaging or exciting. And the fact is we can reach you. Pardon?
We had an argument on campus about turning the wireless off in classrooms. And my remark, and I did not say it out loud because I'm on the IT side, was make your class more interesting, make it more interactive. I was sitting in your class 20 years ago doing a crossword puzzle in the back. There's no difference at all.
Well, I think there's one difference for faculty members, and that is the other thing you can do if you're not wandering someplace on the web because you're bored is that now the web now allows students to be far more edipally aggressive with faculty members and also students in presentations. So it is the case that somebody can turn and say, oh, Professor Smith, you know, your presentation is kind of interesting, but if you look on the screen of my notebook computer, your stuff is 5 years out of date. I'm on the website of the Library of Congress, the National Science Foundation, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Vatican Library, any place, anywhere, and your stuff just isn't there, and we're all wondering why. Whether that's to the faculty member or to a student group, where there might be a competitive posture about presentations at the end of the term. That's very upsetting, I think, for many, in terms of all of a sudden there is an attack on the expertise, either of students who have worked hard or particularly the faculty member who has an ego stake, understandably, in what they're doing and how they're doing it.
No, there's another measure.
How
many times students...
How many times have students...
Yes,
yeah,
it's a great measure.
Or they feel that they have permission to do that in their courses.
Or entitled.
Right?
Well,
yeah, I think there's a kind of implied entitlement in many ways.
So how many times have you been in a class and heard the professor say, that's an interesting question. Could somebody Google that really quickly? This happened in a poetry class I was teaching. How many words in English are stressed on the first syllable, if they're dissyllable words, or on the second syllable? This has to do with how it's going to fit in the poem. I didn't know. A student asked the question. Fantastic question. Any information out there? 10 minutes later, a student raises her hand. Yes, I found out this is the proportion. Gave the citation.
That's one of the nice things, because it ends what I would flippantly call instruction interruptus, in the sense of, oh, somebody will go to the library and come back 3 days later. You can have it in 3 minutes for those kinds of questions.
It also changes, and I would think takes the pressure off of an instructor to feel they have to know everything. How could anyone possibly know everything? It's just not humanly possible, but we've not publicly admitted that. So now we're admitting that to our students. We don't know everything. We're going to learn this together. And that's a democratic classroom.
I need to move us on to another couple of more questions for our conversation. So we've kind of wandered a little bit of the landscape, the student conversation, sort of the policy mandate, whether it's the Truman Commission, the opening preamble to the Higher Education Act of 1965, which states as public policy the role of higher education is to help all who might benefit. A historic shift from even 8 years earlier with National Defense Education Act that talked about all who are able. What is it that higher education, broadly defined, currently does well in the context of the mandate for this panel? In other words, cultivating flexibility, creativity, and critical thinking. What do we need to do better? Gardner, you've been assertive about this from the beginning, so I'm going to let you start with this one. What is it that we do well? I know you've got the critique about what we need to do better.
Sure. I think one of the great strengths of American higher education is its diversity. I was in Boston just last week, and I was at the corner of Boylston and Mass Ave, and there was the Berklee College of Music. I hope they have a good liberal education program there, but I know from the expressions on those students' faces that they were passionately engaged in what they were doing, carrying their gig bags around, carrying their instrument cases around, eating lunch, arguing about what they were talking about in class and what they were learning. There are many opportunities for people to pursue their interests in really meaningful ways within a very diverse system. I think that's a great strength.
We'll come back to the do better in a moment. Deb, what do we do better? What do we do well?
It's the flip side of diversity, it's access. That I believe that when you look around the country or around the world, we do a better job of making higher education accessible, especially to people who wrap back around. You know, in many countries you can't do that.
You're tracked. Porous in terms of come once and come again.
I think we could do a much better job of that. I think we could do a much better job of, I know R1s have a very difficult time looking to community colleges and accepting those students. And yet that's where we could do a much better job.
I want to bring you back to the mandate. You're talking about broad issues. The mandate of the panel conversation is cultivating flexibility, creativity, and critical thinking. What do we do well?
We're starting to include that in our core values. Or I'm seeing that more. The words are there and the actions are following to make sure that those are integrated. Curriculum committees are looking at curriculum and thinking about how are we assessing those? And that's the piece we could do better. I think that the value is there, but how do you, practically speaking, how do you put that in a course? How do you assess it? That assessment is still a challenge in that area.
We're also doing better at thinking about the shape of an education. We're thinking about the first-year experience. We're thinking about cornerstone courses. We're thinking about capstone experiences, so that it's not just one thing after another, and then you've got your credits.
More experiential stuff earlier in the experience for many students, and not just internships, but more collaborative projects.
Right.
To the theme of this, that a movement that began in business schools 30 years ago is moving into across the curriculum and not just into applied areas, whether it's business school or science, is about having students work in teams. Other kinds of stuff, okay. Other thoughts?
I think, and if we want to bring in the IT piece to it, I think the other thing we're doing well is starting to look at e-portfolios and reflective portfolios so that students can reflect back on their own learning and collect evidence of it over time. We could do a much better job with it, but I think the tools are there and the mindset is there in some of the schools and colleges to move forward.
That requires more of an investment on the part of faculty, doesn't it?
Huge.
At a time when faculty are being stressed in their own way.
But it's self-aware. It's an investment that I think once students are out, they have an awareness of their strengths, and actually it makes them much more capable of selling themselves or finding or knowing where to look for the job that they're going to be successful in.
Portfolio, in one sense, becomes a kind of connective tissue that you don't get with a transcript. It helps students take a broader view when it's done well.
Yep.
Okay. Let's do the flip side, as opposed to the dark side. What do we need to do better? If you had if you had the magic wand on your campus, and you could say, I get 3 wishes about what we will do better at each of your institutions. And again, I want to ask you to focus: cultivating flexibility, fostering creativity, and critical thinking. What are the three things that need to be better at USC, Joan?
Oh, generically speaking, not just at USC, but I think I'm going to come back to this assessment piece because many students in particular disciplines are grade-driven, and that can... Shocking, and it can really squelch creativity or flexibility. And in part, it relates to how their courses are structured, but if you ask many students what's your goal, it's not a particular learning goal, it's to get a grade so that they can go on to the next thing. And we just had a conference on our campus yesterday called The Connected Mind. That was our theme. And Henry Jenkins led it off and talked about play and the value of play and how that is an integral part of learning, and that sometimes cheating comes from competition, and play is not as stressful as other kinds of learning because there isn't a competitive thing going on, it's an exploratory thing. So bringing it back to what we could do better is maybe create some sort of balance there where we allow that kind of discovery and exploratory without the pressure and the competition always driving the learning towards
then what I hear in that statement is a direction towards competency-based as opposed to competitive-based learning. So throw out the curve and set clear objectives for mastery.
One solution that I see that's successful in some courses is together with an instructor have rubrics where students are part of the process of developing what they and the instructor agree are these different levels of competency. What is excellent in this? What is creativity in this course? And did we achieve that if you're trying to assess creativity? Not easy.
Not easy.
Say it was easy.
Yeah, creativity, productivity, those are real hard words in academia.
But you can have a conversation and start to create rubrics that are specific to disciplines, specific to courses, and at least try to do
Gardner,
that.
you get to wave the wand?
Yeah, 3 goals. First, re-examine the credit hour. This is a great, it's like oxygen. We think it's there always. No, it's about 100 so years old. It determines everything: teaching loads, GPAs, graduation, degree accomplishment. I think its time has come and gone. We need to rethink it, especially in the age of online learning, when so much of this is asynchronous and not, as Susan Mitros at USC says, measuring the wrong end of the students. That is, how long are they sitting in a chair? First, so think about the credit hour. Second, eliminate the words learning management system. Never speak them again. Learning is not something to be managed. It's not something to be there with a stopwatch, time on page, time on link. I think it's essentially reified what's worst about the industrial model.
Yeah, I'm going to cut you off for a moment. I'm on record in some public audiences saying I suspect there's a lot of semantic remorse in our community, and those of the providers as well, about the whole notion of whether they became as course management systems or learning management systems. As our conversation has moved towards student-centered learning, the management is on the wrong side of the equation in that. And
agree more. Absolutely, but it's a revealing thing that happened when higher education coped with the web by essentially shutting the door to it in terms of its own course spaces.
Well, we needed tools for a lot of us who weren't techies to get to the web, and good, bad, or otherwise,
those tools are easy, they're plentiful, and a lot of them are free, which I think also is very puzzling for higher ed. And the third thing is there has to be some place in higher ed that constantly stirs the pot, thinking about opportunities for innovation within curriculum, within majors, within programs. I'm not talking about the kind of flexibility that chases after the latest ed tech job. I'm talking about the kind of thing that can get students to be thinking about the aims and purposes of education.
What does that look like? Is that something on a campus? Is that a center? Do we all go off looking for grants for this thing?
Well, we're actually thinking about this in a process of reflection that I'm engaged with at Tech right now. That's a really interesting question. If you go to Google Labs, for instance, what they're saying is we're developing a lot of interesting things here. We're not really sure that what will survive. Some of this is swim at your own risk. But look at the interest that this reflects and it's generating. To me, an innovation college would be something like that would say to the particular student who's not risk averse, we're not really sure how this is all going to work out. We're on this journey together, but we do know what we want to get to in the end. We want to prepare you with what Doug Engelbart calls a capability infrastructure that will serve you for the rest of your lives, and that's going to be part of every course you take in this program. I'd like to see that. Not
a lot of students are prepared for that. There are very few...
And that is sad.
There are very few places where ambiguity is a defining aspect of the curriculum.
And that is sad. Students really do have these dual attitudes. They want to explore, they want an authentic education, yet they want the safety net and the comfort of something that's all spelled out for them as well, which then they hold at arm's length and are cynical about. We have to interrupt that cycle.
Taking a model at New College in Sarasota, Florida, Hampshire, half a dozen other places that dot the landscape.
I've got a child at Hampshire College, and yeah, there's some of that in that DNA.
And you know, that doesn't necessarily scale for a lot of other places. How does that, I mean, you imagine that trying to scale at Boulder.
But the internet demonstrates how a self-stimulating, self-organizing set of folks can scale. Why don't we learn from that?
With the 40,000 people who are part of, 60,000 people who are part of the academic community of Boulder, will that scale?
30, but no.
30.
Even at 30, I don't think that would scale. And then I think about...
I mean, what that does is it attacks the periphery, and it creates dissonance at the periphery. But it doesn't necessarily talk about restructuring the core, does it?
No, and I think that what you're getting at actually restructures higher ed completely and utterly, because then we lose the badge. If we don't have the credit hour, if we don't have grades, if we have self-reflection, if we have self-motivation, and I don't want to say what's left because it's not at all a process of subtraction, but what is there? And I don't know. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at that, because I think something has to change. And for me, if I could wave my magic wand, it would be an attention to teaching and an understanding of the cognition of teaching and learning. Because I think overall in higher ed, we all know how to teach because we were taught. And I think that needs to change. But yeah, it would be lovely to scale that.
Right. So we're using what I would characterize as a civilian, was not an English major, amorphous pronouns of responsibility. We talk about we talk about higher education, we talk about a community. Who's responsible for doing this stuff? And who's actually going to, when we talk about enabling students to be agents of change, and then we look at our own efforts, collectively and individually, to make some of these changes happen in our own environments. Ultimately, who is responsible? Where is the point of responsibility? Where's the leverage, if you will, to move us in the directions that we're talking about? Joan?
I'll throw an idealistic view out there. I'm seeing more consortium partnership approaches, and I'll say from where I am as in an IT organization, but with a lot of folks who are academics in my group.
IT
organization.
Okay.
But with a lot of academics that when we being my partners in the library and the Center for Excellence in Teaching at faculty get together, we're trying to have these conversations. I don't know where the authority lies to make that change, but I know there's a group of us now who want to see that change, and we're moving, and I think that figuring out that authority piece is the hard one.
And yet, with due respect to the efforts of you and your colleagues, USC, Duke, NYU, Washington University, there are a handful of institutions that have absolutely chased the academic pecking order over the last 2 and 3 decades in that process on the most traditional kinds of metrics, as also part of the landscape and part of the tension. Do you feel like is it a matter that once you've arrived, you now have the freedom to do those kinds of innovations, and in the process of getting there, you still have to use the old rules of order?
balance.
Okay.
I can't deny that. I think that that's economic drivers in there. But I also know that the values that I'm seeing in action too are a better balance of service, research, and teaching. There is an effort to get students engaged with community. So yes, they're driving towards that with traditional metrics, but how we live as an academic community is changing.
So Gardner, your title is you're Director of Professional Development and Innovation Initiatives. Are you responsible? I'm not saying you're not I'm not saying you're an irresponsible individual, but in the context of our conversation and this topic, who's responsible at Virginia Tech for the issues that we're discussing?
You know, it sounds hopelessly naive. A small group of people got together and thought that innovative initiative should be in the title to send a signal to the organization that somebody's going to be stirring the pot. Okay. It's my responsibility to stir the pot and further to prepare other people to stir the pot right back. It's about conversations. Our keynote speaker later today, Dave Weinberger, famously says in the Clue Train Manifesto, markets are conversations. Why would markets get to be conversations and not higher ed? That doesn't make sense to me. So at some level, we really are talking about partnerships, in some cases, partnerships that have not been closely aligned in the past and should have been, between faculty and staff, people in the library, undergraduates, graduate students, coming together, talking about these things and generating out of these conversations these ideas for change. We have to empower each other to be change agents. In a democracy, we're all responsible.
And Deb, what metrics would you use to evaluate Gardner's efforts?
I just want to jump back. While we're changing everything, I think we should drop the higher from higher education, by the way. I think we need to, if we're unsettling everything, that's one of them. But the metrics for innovation, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, you know, Joan said we need some metrics so we have some agreement about this. So you've now been hired as the consultant at Virginia Tech to say Gardner's had this group, and you're going to go over to USC as well and a half a dozen other places because you're an expert in these areas. How do you evaluate the efforts of the folks who are trying to change the pot and are working on the boundary? In the white space that we talked about before we brought the panel up, you know, how do we know that we're getting there?
I have to admit to being stymied by this because I was tasked with a meta goal of being the leader on campus for teaching and learning with technology. And I asked my boss, well, how are we going to measure that? And for the past year, I've been wondering, how do you measure that? And the only measure we could come up with was a cold call from a faculty who wanted to do something different and didn't know who else to call. Well, I got that cold call, which was nice. But that's not a good measure. Now, if we were omniscient, measures would be easy, but we're not omniscient. And the measures are so, I think at the beginning, so tiny, so isolated, and so non-quantitative that the measures are difficult.
Quick assessment story for you. I was working with a librarian very closely with a course I was teaching when I was at Baylor University. Someone asked her, well, how would you measure whether students are benefiting from this or not? I was very frustrated, and I said, what I want to know is, did their curiosity increase? Did the range of their capacity for interest increase? Not just interest in what we were talking about in class, but are their minds bigger? Are they freer to explore? Are they more likely to step outside of their boundaries? Well, it turns out there's a whole psychology of interest. There's a curiosity and exploration inventory you can administer as a pre-post test. Are you actually now more open to experience than you were? Are you more prepared to seek out things on your own now than you were? We don't hear about that in the talk about assessment because we're not talking about core issues. And for me, interest is one of them, recognizing that also part of our job is to help awaken students' interests, not simply identify what they are and push only what they already want.
So I'm glad you're bringing that up because another partner, at our conference we had two keynotes. We had Henry, and then at lunchtime we had Mary Helen Imardino-Yang, and she is at the Institute for the Brain and Creativity. So now you're having a conversation. We were talking about technology, and what she was talking about is that, and I'm going to really put this in a very abbreviated version, that she said, look at the brain when the area of the brain for reflection and the area of the brain that's outward looking. And with technology, that it can enhance both, but you have to really be mindful of how you're using it. And we tend, you know, the kid who can't let go of the cell phone and is like, oh my God, what do I do? Or people who can't let go of their laptop cell phones, and the quiet is really disturbing. When you look at the brain activity, that part of reflection is not being used as much, and you need that for innovation. You need to pause and reflect in order to connect ideas. And so bringing in that view that's a scientific view of what's going on physiologically when we're engaged with technology, when we're in learning, when we're engaged with each other, is a real interesting other perspective to inform what we're talking about. So new partners for us, cognitive psychologists, brain and creativity people.
And what's the timeline for the documentation? I mean, you know, we're talking about colleges and universities. I won't use higher education in deference to Deb. We have fairly rigid cycles of academic calendars and committees. You know, at what point then a report comes from any one of your groups, ad hoc or formally chartered on your campuses, that says we should do this? You're still talking 3 to 5 years, a generation, a cohort of students.
Joan's got a number.
I do. Yeah. Oh, I was saying that.
Yes, you do.
Yes,
don't you, Joan?
I came up with 12 years.
12 years.
And that was based on...
I'm sorry, 12 years from...
For some significant change based on 3 changes in government cycles. And I just kind of picked that, but I'm thinking we're seeing a nudge, and over those 3 sets of changes, 3 changes in administration, I feel like that's one horizon. Pardon me?
Cohorts of students going through.
Right, and exactly, because I think the incoming...
That seems like an incredibly long time, given the urgency of, given the tone and tenor of a conversation that seems to have some urgency to it,
Academy
and has had urgency
right?
to it for 60 years. Yeah.
Yeah, but we've been around for thousands. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Does the technology, we've touched in some of the conversation today about the role of the technology as a source of dissonance, as a source of access, as a source of new expertise. Does the technology make this conversation, and the easy and sometimes inappropriate access to the technology, make it easier or make it harder, or just make it more complex? As you think about this, again, I want to bring you back to the anchor point, cultivating flexibility, creativity, and critical thinking. Does the technology make it easier, harder, or just more complex? Deb?
I think just more complex, or bigger, maybe is the word I'm thinking about. During the video, when the students were talking about experiential, tangible education, when the professor talked about interactivity, I thought about what is the role of instructors, and the word scaffolding popped into my head. And so scaffolding, I think, is part of the teaching process, the guiding process, but there is so much out there, and there's so much access to so much information, that I think that act of scaffolding and the act of teaching critical awareness about what you're looking at. So not just Lady Gaga, but a nice review of Lady Gaga, and is it the right level?
With rich metaphors and historic,
exactly.
Okay. Hot links as opposed to footnotes.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Easier, harder, more complex? What do you think, Gardner, in terms of the conversation?
Definitely more complex, but also I think it introduces new competencies where we used to have public speaking and how to write well across the curriculum.
Now it's death by PowerPoint.
I think it's effective communication. You know, we have an engineering student who is a film major.
Yeah.
I think that, and I'm now, especially at USC, at a place where our president would like to see multimedia literacy as a core set of competencies across the curriculum, which easier said than done, but it's another communication and critical thinking
What would that look like?
tool.
I mean, what is the conversation at USC about, you know, beyond the kind of traditional Chinese menu of so much from column A, column B, and column C of sciences, humanities, and social sciences? Where you know, is this now you just take the critical thinking course the way that years ago students took a keyboarding course? How's this going to play out at SC?
well, I can speak a little bit to the multimedia literacy piece that we're talking about. What do assignments look like that integrate multimedia literacy? So it's not a course by itself and separate from everything else, but again, it's integrated. And in any discipline,
So
chemistry,
again, I'm going to be a little
whatever.
flippant with a preemptive apology. Is this just another version of writing across the curriculum, so it's going to be multimedia literacy across the curriculum?
We hope not, but again, we don't have an answer yet. We're still figuring this out because you have people with a variety of competencies in that as instructors, you know, not just students.
So you have to work both sides in terms of the instructors,
I
a
think
willingness on the
so.
part of the instructors, and however long the students will let you, direct them before they sort of stand up and say, I've had enough, or we won't. Gardner, what's your take on all this?
I think now, if by technology you mean information and communication technologies.
Broadly defined.
I think the jig is up. We've wanted to pretend that education is more like building an automobile than dealing with the messy, complex realities of human existence. The jig is up. We can't pretend that anymore. The internet is out there. Our students are not naive about that part. They may be naive about other things. So a forced march across a flattened plain, it's not going to do anymore. And the fact is that the best teaching and the best learning have always engaged with passion, have always had to do with interest. Psychologists argue that interest is an emotion. Well, we have to start thinking about emotion. In engineering classes, I would say yes. Clearly the professor in the video was emotionally attached to what he was doing. You want to make things relevant to people's lives, make things relevant to who they believe they are at core as a human being and what it is that makes us human. These are fundamental questions that get acted out every single day within this telecommunications revolution. We can't simply do the freeze-dried approach anymore. Can't do it.
I'll agree that the gig is up. But what concerns me, for example, if I look at the cyberpunk movement, Anya Kretzmeyer's book and some other stuff, is the outliers ultimately get poured into a silo of credentials. I mean, case in point. So I was doing some work with Apple long ago in a faraway time in the pre-Mac world. A lot of the folks who helped design the Mac didn't have formal credentials. They weren't college graduates, let alone Stanford graduates. Yet there were a lot of state college graduates, not just the UC system, but folks who went to the Cal States who worked at Apple early on. And one of them was a 13-year-old kid who happened to do some of the coding and design, Chris Espinoza, because his mom worked and worked on the early Mac manuals. A lot of those folks wouldn't get through the door at Apple today. And good, bad, or otherwise, I think when these conversations begin on the periphery, ultimately when they begin to move to the center, we'll also begin to look at how do I pour it into a silo? What's the metric I use for creativity as opposed to, this person's done some creative stuff. How do I get past the HR office? What do we do with that issue? Or is that just something that's out there and abstract?
So we've got an opportunity for students to publish their own authentic reflections, showcase their own work as they're going through school on the World Wide Web.
Okay.
If we engage with that, the metric becomes, so you've written this blog post, you've shared this data, you've described this experience. Are you driving interest? Are you getting comments? Is anybody engaged by the way you are presenting yourself as a learner? What was the metric that got those folks in the door at Apple? So how do we measure? Was Steve Jobs good, bad, human being wise? What's the metric for that? Look at the interest that what he's done has driven. I think we have those opportunities. I am not an edupunk. I don't think that we need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we do need to have some way of encouraging people always to examine those core assumptions and to be able, again, put your stuff out there. Don't wait for my permission. If somebody gets interested, let me know. This is good.
Yeah, is this aligned with your notion about the value of the e-portfolio, both as a private as well as a public document?
To an extent, I think there's great overlap between the two.
And what do you
Having
think,
done
Joan?
a couple of e-portfolio initiatives, same here, and also watching faculty who are encouraging students to use blogging, for example, to test the waters and put their ideas out there. And it's scary because once students have exposed, you're making yourself vulnerable because anybody could respond and they're not necessarily going to like or appreciate what they may come back.
Yeah, students have a refreshing or aggressive kind of candor depending on the context. And we have unfortunately seen both the best and worst of that recently in terms of some of the activity in social networks on college campuses.
And I would say the issue is not that the professor becomes vulnerable. The professor is vulnerable. We just tell the truth about it now, right? We are all vulnerable.
It's also the student.
Exactly. Learning is about vulnerability, isn't it? If you're invulnerable, then I guess you're impervious to learning as well.
Okay. I need to take us back to one question because it speaks to some of the tensions in this conversation about creativity, flexibility, and good, bad, or otherwise, that's the notion of metrics. You know, I thought one of the interesting sort of throwaway lines in the student video was a certain Meyer-Briggs stereotype. Right. That's a language that we would not have heard 20 years ago, you know, from college students, but that has moved into, as a kind of a metric, it's kind of a shorthand. We do this with one another. We do this when Sean and others are going to go out to the world, and we need some metrics, you know, whether it's a transcript or an e-portfolio. Institutions need these metrics in some ways for internal assessment, internal feedback. It's the nuance of using data as a resource, not as a weapon, but unfortunately, we can't always control that. What metrics should we be using, or what measures should we be thinking about in this conversation of fostering creativity, flexibility, and critical thinking? Deb.
For the love of all that is good, not grades.
Not grades, okay.
Not with...
grades with, grades without, throw them out?
No, but if we're going to use metrics to measure creativity or flexibility, the way we currently grade students, no. Okay. Rubric grading, especially if students have input into what the measures are, possibly. But the way the grades are right now, I've got a son in engineering who says things like, well, I only mastered 70%, but I'll still get an A, because that's where the curve is. And I'm going, what if you build something that falls down? But because you didn't know that 30%. So that would be very bad.
Well, and engineering is actually a good example, unfortunately, at too many institutions where the grades are also used to essentially vote people off the island.
Yes, correct.
Sort of the misguided meritocracy, if you will, of look to the left and right, and half of you won't be here, of driving people out. And yet we know if we look not at if we look at the talent demography of undergraduates, I want to be careful with my language here. The most academically able, is that a nice way of saying smartest? But the most academically able students really begin in the sciences. We have a huge talent loss to the pre-med students who run into organic chemistry, who vote themselves off the island because they get a B or a B minus, thinking I'll never get to med school. We have huge talent losses in some other areas in engineering and some of the STEM fields. We don't do a good job with that. Joan, you look like you want to get into this.
Because I'm thinking about engineering, and I was at a conference talking about the Horizon Report to the engineering accreditation group. I'm blanking on the name right now, but the topic was about using grand challenges in teaching, and I think that is such an innovative and incredibly powerful approach that should be across many curricula, and it actually is counter to the grade thing because the measure of success there is how innovative were you in thinking about that grand challenge. Obviously, you're not going to, there are 10 grand challenges. You can vote on which one you think. And one of them, interestingly, is creating personalized learning environments. Engineers have chosen that as one of the top 10 grand challenges, bringing that into classrooms and saying, what are you as students thinking about that? And what projects can you build around that as instructors? So I think that's not grade, that's a very different way of assessing, you know, success in that field.
Measures, Gardner?
Yeah, I would say, picking up on the grand challenges idea, we need to be thinking about assessing integrative learning. Right now, we test in crude measures of recall. Memory is important. I don't want my brain surgeon consulting Wikipedia when the scalp is open, right? It's like, no, I'd really like you to know which hemisphere is which. Please, write on it with a Sharpie or whatever. But at the same time, we are not thinking in these larger, more complex, more systems-oriented ways. So our students are spectacularly ill-prepared for the complexities of the world they'll inhabit. They're really good at taking a test at the end of a course. Where is the opportunity to assess integrative learning? And that's harder. It's a lot harder. First of all, you have to think, What is it we're measuring? What is understanding? Try to ask 5 people, what does it mean to understand something, and how do you demonstrate it?
Yeah, that's like asking about faculty productivity. Good luck with that one. I want to give you each a quick chance for one last question, and I want very short answers because we want to provide some options for the audience as well. What haven't we asked in this conversation that we need to attend to? Very quickly. What questions haven't we touched on? What have we missed? What's the sin of omission or commission? Mine as the moderator, yours as a panel participant. And just go very quickly down. Deb, what have we missed?
We kind of hit all the big questions, I think. But I think what we haven't gotten to, and we've touched on it, is again, going back to that, are we happy or efficient? You know, going back to...
Are you happy or efficient?
I would like to be both. Okay. Where I am right now. And it reminds me of, you know, Tiger Mom came out. We just talked about this at breakfast a little bit ago. And this is a mother who employs certain parenting techniques to make sure that her daughters are always at the top of her class. And in this article it said, well, we should adopt some of these techniques. And of course I was repulsed by the idea anyway.
A Yale law professor with a lot of resources.
Right, but it doesn't scale. Doesn't scale. So, but it comes down to what's the meaning of learning, what's the meaning of life, and all of that.
Quickly, Gardner, what haven't we asked?
I don't think we've really begun to ask questions about the scale of this moment. Clay Shirky says we're living in the middle of the largest increase in expressive capability in the history of the human race. Gee, you wake up the next day and you think that's true. You can't pretend we're not living in the most disruptive time in human civilization.
I wonder if we're, as part of our education, really creating social change agents. You know, and is that part of is that on our agenda, the way that Dewey put it out there?
How would you know? I mean, there's a story about Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai when they first met just ahead of Nixon going to China. And as 2 historians bantering and posturing with one another, apparently Zhou Enlai says, what do you think of Henry about the French Revolution? And Henry goes on, and Zhou Enlai says, you know, it's still a little early to tell. So.
Okay, I do have one example. We had a TEDx at USC, and there were a couple of projects where you feel like there are people thinking this way. Code for America. 12 fellows who believe government can be okay. We're technologists. We're going to go like Teach for America, only we're going to code for America. And we go to your community and we work with you and we use technology as our wand.
All right. We want to open questions to the audience. We have a couple of minutes before Wendy turns off the microphones. And I think there's some folks walking around with mics. If you would, please let us know who you are. Give us a quick question as opposed to a statement or a soapbox. And if it's addressed to a particular member of the panel, please go that way as well. First question. Don't all jump up at once. This is like a freshman seminar. Please. And you are?
Hi, my name is Eva Delera. I'm from the Open University of Catalonia in Barcelona.
Well, you probably get the award for the greatest distance today. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Well, as you were talking, you briefly mentioned something I caught that you said, that you didn't want to talk about faculty productivity. And actually, in all this discussion, I wonder how much weight we're putting to the students and how little we're putting to faculty. Meaning, interest and curiosity needs to be contagious, passion, no? And that begins with the faculty. And the faculty are sitting down and saying, well, the system is old. Well, I'm not getting enough rewards in exchange for what I do. And I think that the call should be for real teachers to go out there and do their best, not their system's best. No, so I think that the missing, maybe as you were asking, what did we miss today? Maybe a question, I'd like...
A question about also reassessing the whole model of faculty review. And if we're asking our students to be flexible, creative, what are organizations doing to foster that beyond just telling faculty members write research papers and get grants, but a higher level of creativity and
we're expecting
curiosity.
Creativity from our students, but we're not being creative ourselves, I think.
Panel, anybody want to step into that one?
I think you can talk about faculty development in this area as well, and in some ways that's more agile than thinking about the systems of professional review.
Faculty development doesn't have a good history.
No, it does not. and that's part of the pot I'm stirring. I think faculty development has typically been in-service days on steroids, workshop-oriented, very much come together, peel the shrink wrap off.
Pizza and coffee.
You know, so what if faculty development became more like ongoing lifelong learning for faculty? What if the idea of a seminar with no deliverables other than engagement, commitment, and a willingness to reflect publicly about what you're learning becomes part of faculty development? Then you see faculty engaged as lifelong learners right out there in front. And we talk a lot of trash about faculty. Faculty are very smart people who like to engage with ideas.
And respond to the incentives we provide for them.
That's true too, but Dan Pink has argued pretty persuasively that a lot of that has to be intrinsic. So how do you awaken that joy of learning in someone who's had it pretty much beaten out of them through graduate school and all the reward structures in colleges and universities? It can happen. I've seen it happen.
Okay. Other questions? Please. You are, sir?
Stuck in my chair.
You have a camera. Did you get a release for all the pictures you took?
I'm rising to the occasion now. Yes, I have a camera.
Did you get releases for all the pictures you took?
Pardon me?
Did you? This is the internet age. Did you get releases for all the pictures you took?
Do I have a reason for all the pictures?
No, not a reason, a release. I'm sure you've got a reason. I'm sorry, I'm playing with you.
You're actually being, well, I am on the faculty here. I take a lot of photographs around the university.
Okay.
That wasn't the question I was going to ask, but thank you for making sure that we're behaving ethically here. Or trying to. Okay, I'm on the faculty here, but I'm also at an intergenerational school, public school. And I think the notion of thinking, the temporality of our thinking is a really important issue here. The question, though, or the comment I'm going to make is around narrative. You mentioned e-portfolios, and I celebrate those. You talked about qualitative research for assessment, and you talked about integrative thinking. I do think we are awash with stories, and that the power of technology to enhance our capabilities as human beings to do that particular part of our capacity may be important. So comments about that?
Stories?
I think storytelling is an amazing learning strategy, actually, because that's what things stick to, that's how things stick. And yeah, I'm all for that.
Stories are the fundamental organizing mode of consciousness. It's how we share our deepest experiences with each other. And it also brings a kind of respect for the self. If there's a respect and an opportunity to tell that story, oh, I guess I must be worth hearing.
All right. Please, sir, going to my left, your right.
My name is Wallace Krebs. I'm a consultant and have some experience as an adjunct faculty. So what do you think the role of adjunct faculty is in the future of higher ed?
Oh, it's a bull market for adjuncts, unfortunately, in many sectors. But I don't think that's the question you were asking. Mm-hmm. Not how many are we going to hire. It's a more matter of their integration in the community. Is that right?
Yeah, what's their role? They currently seem to be the slave labor of universities.
Grad student? Yeah, well, it's an extension of being a grad student.
Yeah.
It's having a tweed vest, not a tweed jacket. I'm sorry?
There's a possible role for them.
Yeah. Panel, adjuncts?
Well, I agree that it is the slave labor that's keeping our institutions afloat, and I think I have a big problem with that. When we look at people who come, we also have a teaching and learning conference. I'd say half of them are adjunct and community college folks who are so invested and so passionate in their discipline and in infecting students with passion and really attentive to teaching methods that will help do that. I would love to see it change, but we've gotten rid of credit hours, we've gotten rid of higher and higher education, we've probably gotten rid of tenure, so I think we can change that too.
Good luck with that one. I'm going to turn to Lev Gonik with a question.
Thanks, Casey. So one of the things that we've become awash with is a tsunami of secondary sources. That's pretty much what information technology appears to most students to be. Is just you just Google it. I mean, that's become essentially the way we do methodology today. I've just finished teaching a class in which the entire course was based on a much different methodology, an ancient methodology of essentially apprenticing with primary sources. And in fact, the entire course was enabled through information technology, all based on video conferencing with experts. Sages on the side, coaching, not necessarily people who pretend to deliver all the knowledge that in fact is available reading in a secondary kind of fashion. So I think one of the things that we might be thinking about, an area that we haven't tackled, is the ability to turn students on to the discovery of the amazing possibilities of leveraging information technology by accessing primary sources, people who are in the lab, people who are in a policy think tank, people who are actually in a position to decide whether or not a performance piece is going to happen or not, and actually make that the starting point in a very different kind of orientation to method. And I offer you that and look forward to your comments.
I think you raise a really interesting point, Lev. And certainly there have been a group of outliers, early adopters among students at all times, whether it was letters or telephone calls and now the internet, who would actually reach out. And it's moving that behavior and fostering that behavior to a larger part of the population. I think the tension with that, I'm reminded of a crack made by a Berkeley professor who was kind of a Berkeley Don, talking to one of his younger colleagues, is to remind the young, newly hired assistant professors that office hours protect you from your students because they provide a bounded time of contact for all the other peripheral stuff. And I think that in an era of tension over time and the pressures that faculty confront in the pragmatic world, the reaching out in a bounded environment is a great resource for students and faculty. It's when they all start knocking at my door that I begin to chafe at that. But I'm just one. Panel, what do you think?
Another great opportunity for student engagement. How can we help students understand what kind of contact is most likely to get a good response? What is most appropriate? How can we help students understand that they are not witnesses to a conversation, they are beginning to be participants in a conversation, and to frame that in a way that is going to be really appropriate and welcoming for the other people they want to invite into the conversation. I had a student write an author of a book we were using in a particular seminar, and gently but firmly say, why did you write that? I'm not really sure, here are some counter thoughts. And the person wrote back, he was a professor at NYU, wrote back and essentially said the same thing he'd written in the book. And so my student unfortunately learned that there are primary sources who don't want to engage. They have the safety not only of the office hours, but the book. I said it, I'm not engaging with those ideas anymore. But she also learned that there's a place in school to be bold in that way.
And we want to foster that.
Yeah.
Where's Wendy? Back to you, Wendy.
Okay. So let me just hop up on the stage here for a minute, and please join me in thanking this panel.